Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm really thrilled to be introducing Kert Davies. He's the founder and director of the Climate Investigation Center. He's a well-known researcher, media spokesperson, and climate activist who has been conducting corporate accountability research and campaigns for more than 20 years. Davies was the chief architect of the Greenpeace web project Exxon Secrets, launched in 2004, which helped expose the oil giant ExxonMobil's funding of organizations and individuals who work to discredit the validity of climate science and delay climate policy action. More recently, Davies established the Polluter Watch program at Greenpeace, which launched the report Koch Industries Secretly Funding the Climate Denial Machine. He has also been featured in the PBS Frontline episode, The Power of Big Oil, which I know a lot of you watched. And I wanted to also point out that at the very beginning of this series, we heard from Dan Ziegert, who is Kert's colleague at the Climate Investigation Center. And so Dan spoke with us about the Satartia CO2 pipeline explosion. So his shop does amazing work. And so I'm really thrilled to turn it over to you. And right before I do, just wanted to remind everybody, if you have questions for Kert when he's done with his presentation, we'll ask questions. So put them either into the Q&A or the chat. I'll be poking around looking for them in both places. All right, so with that, thank you so much, Kert. Take it away.
Thank you, Karen. That was a very generous introduction, and it's great to be here. I'm going to just kick off my PowerPoint. So this is a lot of slides, but I go really fast, and it's not meant for you to read everything. I'm just sort of imagine it like a movie, but it's in slides. This is going to cover a bunch of stuff that I've done in the past, 10 years, really. Can you see that? Am I good? All right. That is related to climate denial, the corporate funding of climate denial, how they push false solutions, and now how they're being held accountable by you guys and others. First of all, I'm from Philadelphia, so I have to give a little shout out to the Eagles. Go Birds. I don't know how many of you are, which parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, whatever, but it's fun. And I grew up in Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s, and exactly 50 years ago, I was tromping around on the banks of the Delaware and near Philadelphia, and I just got this box back from my mother. These are shards of colonial pottery that we were digging up out of this dump pile right on the banks of the Delaware in Philadelphia. Of course, the river was pretty toxic then in our area down our way. Delaware Water Gap was cleaner, but below Trenton, it was a mess, and you didn't go near it. And now it's a little bit cleaner thanks to you all's efforts, and hopefully it's trending in the right direction. So that's just a little bit about me. And these are my web assets that I run now. I worked at Greenpeace for 13 years before forming the Climate Investigation Center. Climate Files is now the archival library that everybody turns to for all of the old climate internal documents. Mentioned my Exxon Secrets project. It's now down because the software stopped being supported by Adobe. Thanks very much, and it can't run anymore, but I'm trying to get it back up. And this was a interactive database where you could find out where Exxon's money was going quietly to fund climate denial voices. I'll talk about that in a bit. So today we're going to talk about, when I started campaigning on climate change in the late 90s, we knew Exxon was the biggest problem. We knew they were the biggest bully. They were the loudest denier, but we had no idea that they knew about all this in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And those documents only came to light in about 2014, 15, 16 through investigative journalists who dug up and found these documents, found octogenarians with boxes of documents. Who knows how? I don't even know how they got them. Found them in archives. Exxon published its own archives and left some really key documents they didn't scrub out of it. And what the companies did, even though they knew better, is they chose a path of denial and delay, and they really tried to block all the rest of us from understanding how dire the situation was, even though internally they were kind of freaked out about it, some of them anyway. And then they attacked scientists, they attacked, scientific studies, and you still see this today, downplaying the science. And any of your neighbors who think that climate change is not real or is not serious, part of that misunderstanding is due to this misinformation that was vended by Exxon and its minions for the past several decades. You can directly tie it. They put stuff on Rush Limbaugh. They put op-eds in papers. They did all these tactics to try to install denial. And I'll show you a few details. This is the last big texty slide, by the way. So, and now they're of course pushing false solutions like carbon capture, like you've heard about, and algae and other things. But the accountability hammer is about to fall, and it's already falling. So they knew. We sort of hear that, we know that, but here's the 1965 report to President Johnson on the environment, the first real environmental report by the government. And there's a whole chapter on carbon dioxide and climate change. 1965, I was 2. Okay, great. So nobody really talks about this, but that's a long time ago. And it was one of the most prominent pollution issues of the time. It was selected as one of the major topics in this really big report to the government, to the president, by a whole panel of scientists. Fast forward 1982, there's a few memos that have turned up where you see internally, there's a whole review of carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect, or the enhanced greenhouse effect, as they called it. This just came out. Some of this just came out a couple of weeks ago. You probably saw this news where scientists looked back at Exxon's predictions and realized they were really smart and they were right. Their internal models matched up with what has happened. Now, what we now see as the fast forward pollution, the emissions curve and the temperature curve, that the carbon dioxide is going up and the temperature. So, and here's the internal proprietary, internal use only graphs. And, one of them shows the Exxon model, the 21st century study. So they were doing their own forecasting of how energy would be used for their own purposes, right? To have, to be able to sell fuels and make money. But they were concerned. They were worried about it. Here's a memo where someone writes a summary and another scientist writes back and says, I think you're downplaying this, because if CO2, if this plays out, it will be catastrophic for at least a substantial fraction of the Earth's population. That's a pretty huge statement in 1981 by an Exxon executive, internally again. Shell, it's not just Exxon. Shell documents came out via a Dutch journalist, one of which is a 5-year study conducted from 81 through 85 inside Shell, not to be released. It says confidential on the front page. And this is a 1988 report wherein they say by the time the global warming becomes detectable, it could be too late. So they predicted what's happened in the last few years, where it is absolutely certain that these specific things are happening due to human emissions. Things are and it says here, goes on to say it may be too late to reduce the effects or even to stabilize the situation. So this is a pretty dire warning inside Shell. They didn't tell shareholders, they didn't tell the rest of us, but they were worried about it. And they were also worried about their own assets, which is where these lawsuits come in. Exxon, for example, had a project. They found a boatload of gas off of Indonesia in the early 80s. It's a massive deposit, but it turned out to be 71% carbon dioxide, the rest methane, right? So this often happens in gas fields where there's carbon dioxide mixed in with the methane, and they wanted to strip out the methane and sell the gas, but it was so much methane that they, in their own documents, said will be the largest point source on Earth. The only place you use the term point source is when you're talking about pollution. And that was already a term of art because the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act were already in play in the early 80s. And they didn't want to be a direct pollution source for carbon dioxide. They canceled the project. They left the gas in the ground. They left millions of dollars in the ground. But before they did that, they tried to figure out carbon capture. They were trying to figure out if they could blow the carbon dioxide back under the ground. It would take too much energy. They built, this is a picture of a huge bubbler they were going to put under the sea and just bubble the carbon dioxide into the ocean. But then their own scientists said, well, that would acidify the water and destroy everything for miles around. So it's probably not a good idea. So this is just to say, very smart people, they're trying to make money, of course, they're trying to sell the gas, but they took a precautionary approach here because they didn't want to be seen as a polluter, which is pretty interesting in retrospect. And then they chose denial. This is another internal document where they said the Exxon position is to emphasize the uncertainty. So they knew that what they were doing at that point was emphasizing that we didn't have all the answers and maybe this will be a problem, maybe it won't. But they were better in 1988 than they became in the early 90s. I'll get to that. It was also more than the oil companies. Here's a campaign by the electric utilities and coal industry. It started in 1991. They saw a more existential threat because coal would go first, of course, if you were going to cut carbon. And they formed this campaign that this is their document. The strategy was to reposition global warming as a theory, not a fact. Straight up, let's deny it. They put ads in newspapers in several American cities. They did test marketing. They did a whole, a trial run of this thing to see if they could change people's minds deliberately. And this matches a tobacco document where an internal Brown Williamson document said, doubt is our product. I don't know if you saw that, but that's in that line. Doubt is our product. That's the strategy of the tobacco industry was to instill doubt about smoking. Then they launch industry. You can read the list, the whole American industrial bloc, from mining to steel, Petroleum Institute, cement, railroads, all of them join and form this Global Climate Coalition, which is really a PR push. It was a front group. It was formed within the National Association of Manufacturers in 1989 in response to the birth of political attention to climate change. We have a ton of their documents now that came out via a lawsuit and other archives that we've mined and we've put up on Climate Files. And in those documents, you see that they were internally realizing that they could not deny outright that climate change was real, but they could attack the computer models. Computer models take huge computers that can't really do a fine-grained assessment of anything. So we can keep talking about that for a long time because the computers won't be able to predict if Superstorm Sandy is a real thing or a climate thing. They then, in this draft, they also, the writer argues that most of the denial arguments are not convincing. And they're interesting questions, but they would not offset the problem. And he's trying to caution, he's a mobile scientist, he's trying to caution the corporate guys from leaning on these arguments that, oh, it's just the satellites are off, or it's the sunspots, or it's clouds are confusing, all these different arguments that were being proffered. But they leave this out of the final thing that's published. In the meantime, they find surrogate voices. They find people and institutions, free market, libertarian think tanks who hate the government, to put out messages that Exxon can't be caught saying. One example is Willie Soon. He's even worse. He's an academic. He works at the Smithsonian. It's at a place called Harvard Smithsonian. It has nothing to do with Harvard, but it's on the campus. And he's got a doctor in front of his name. And he puts out lots of information about sunspots. And he publishes papers about how it's not greenhouse gases at all. It's just cycles of the sun. So we did an expose many years ago now, 8 years ago, where we found the money that was going to Willie Soon. And here, back to that draft, here's a mobile scientist in 1995 saying this argument doesn't hold water. It would account for less than 0.1% of the variability, but they keep funding them. And we found through a Freedom of Information Act request to Smithsonian that Willie Soon had received over $1 million from ExxonMobil, American Petroleum Institute, Southern Company, and the Koch foundations. And we got that into play. Here's a study that Willie Soon did, for example, with that money. Suddenly this astrophysicist is an expert in polar bears somehow, and does a study with a number of other paid, operatives or surrogates of the fossil fuel industry. And the study, he acknowledges in the study that it was paid for by the Charles Koch Foundation, ExxonMobil, and American Petroleum Institute. Great, thanks for that. But why would ExxonMobil be interested in a study that said polar bears are just, things are changing, but it's not climate change. And maybe they're better off. Maybe polar bears are fine. Everything's fine. In 2006, that would have been a very important message because the polar bear was being considered for the Endangered Species Act. And then there's a lot of propaganda we have in our files that they publish directly. Just read the cover. 1996, a glossy manual with Lee Raymond, the CEO, publishing an essay about, it's going to inflict economic damage, and we need to be careful about doing anything when the evidence is not clear. They published op-eds in the New York Times almost every week, Mobil and then Exxon. Many of them doubting the science, many of them, intentionally directed at policymakers. In 1998, a memo was leaked to an environmental group that is a blockbuster, and it was on the front page of the Times. And it's a full plan, a multi-million-dollar plan to recruit voices to force uncertainty. So this is the key page. Victory will be achieved when average citizens, let me go back to that, average citizens understand uncertainties, when the media, when senior industry leadership, they talk about targeting school teachers, targeting TV personalities and members of Congress, and get them to say things they wouldn't have said otherwise. Members of this team included Exxon, Chevron, and the Southern Company. There's some other notable free market think tanks on this list. If you skim it, in the plan, they talk about the measurement of success will be the members of Congress that they reach, numbers of communications by members of Congress from their constituents. So they're going to get letters written to members of Congress saying we don't believe in climate change. So it's a full-on plan. How much of it they executed after it was revealed, we don't fully know, but we know that parts of it did go forward. Sorry, excuse the illustrations. And in the plan, they talk about specific funding sources and specific fund allocators, flow through. So the money would come from all these industry trade associations and their members, and then it would go through the American Legislative Exchange Council, Committee for Constructive Tomorrow, CEI, Frontiers of Freedom, and the Marshall Institute. You may know some of those groups from different fights you've fought. And in fact, here's just the logos. You can see these are all the things that are mentioned in that memo, all the different entities that could have been involved and remained involved in denying and blocking climate solutions. And many of them remain a problem to this day. CFACT is now fighting offshore wind, for example. And Exxon funded all those groups. All the ones that were named in that memo, Exxon sent money to in subsequent years. They were funding them through the mid-2000s heavily, some of them much longer. ALEC, they just dumped a couple years ago. So we know they did something. So then they go to the false solutions narrative. And this is where, the CCS narrative, the fights on fracking, the fights on gas really well. I don't need to explain all that. This just broke an hour ago that Exxon has now quietly retreated from this massive investment in algae. They ran ads on television from 2016 through 2019 that by one estimate cost over $60 million to run, and ran 10,000 times and reached millions of American eyeballs, showing beautiful pictures of beautiful scientists with bottles of green algae, and made people believe that was what they were doing, that they were making fuel. In fact, it's not, and they are now retreating from it because it isn't making them money, and they're making more money drilling for new oil, obviously. And then I don't know if this is going to play. Let me just, that'll require me to change screens, but they ran a lot of ads. This is an ad where they say, what if a plant became more like a plant, an industrial plant became more like a plant, and there's flowers growing out of an industrial facility, and it's magically capturing the carbon. But their main project on that has not been shown to bear fruit. That was a project with the Southern Company, but now you'll see news of Exxon pitching a massive carbon dump in the Gulf of Mexico, where they're going to pipe all the carbon down to the Gulf of Mexico. You know this story. Dan told you our investigation of the pipeline rupture in Mississippi 3 years ago now, February. We're still in touch with the people down there. They are still ill from this impact and experiencing health impacts. And it's still not solved. But this is a lovely town. I mean, it could be the Upper Delaware, right? It could be anywhere. And this pipeline was running nearby. Many of the people didn't know it was there. Even the first responders didn't know it was there. When it burst, they had no idea what they were dealing with. Luckily, the first responders had like self-contained breathing apparatus, scuba masks, essentially, with an air tank, so they could get in there without being knocked out, and they rescued people. This is the pipeline that blew up. It was just a 24-inch pipeline, carbon dioxide pipeline being used to take carbon dioxide to bubble more oil out of the earth in a process called enhanced oil recovery. But this is one of the largest pipeline networks owned by Denbury in Louisiana down to Mississippi, or Mississippi down to Louisiana. There are 5,000 miles of such pipelines, all of them used by the oil industry to get more oil right now. But what we're headed for is this. And this is a map by Princeton University, published in right after Biden was elected, to prove that the Biden scheme would work, that all the climate promises would work. And this is their carbon capture map. So that middle big dark line down the middle of the screen, they estimated to be a 4 or 8 foot diameter pipeline that would carry all the carbon from the upper Midwest, from everywhere down to the Gulf of Mexico. But if you zoom in, here's, sorry, it's blurry, but here's your region, and you know, the nice Princeton mappers avoided Princeton. You know, you can see there's no pipeline going through Princeton, but it cuts right across where you're probably very familiar, and also avoids Philadelphia. It kind of neatly avoids Philadelphia, Manhattan, and DC, but goes somewhere west of those major populations. But they weren't considering people at all in this Princeton exercise. And it's just lines on a map with the shortest distance between those lines. And the gray on this map is the big geologic areas where they think they can dump carbon dioxide safely. And safely meaning we hope, but it's huge ancient oceans that are buried in the geology, saline aquifers. So it's massively salty water. It's not just salt, it's got other stuff in it. And it's deep, deep, deep. And theoretically, it would stay under there for a long time. It takes a lot of effort, and there's a lot of problems with it. But mainly, I wanted to show you that this is a neighborhood issue. This is right near all of us, where they would have to put this stuff. And here's another set of maps that's done by the Carbon Capture Coalition, which looks different, but it's essentially the same. Everything's going south to the Gulf of Mexico or the Permian Basin. There's a few areas where they could dump it in other places where they think they could dump it safely, but most of the upper Midwest and Pennsylvania has been drilled so many times that they can't really trust that it's going to stay underground or be safe. Also might cause earthquakes. You know some of this, but you zoom in again, and here's a nice pipeline that they've just graciously drawn right through the Delaware Valley. Yeah, and you know, if you think about it, like all the refineries east of you in, I don't know where you all live, but I'm assuming, but in northern New Jersey, you all know northern New Jersey, it's, you know, a toxic wasteland, has been for generations. Dozens of refineries, chemical facilities, other emitters. If you were going to try to solve that, there's no place to put it nearby, because the coastal plain, there's not geology in New Jersey where you could drill down and try to insert this stuff into the geology again, right? Put the carbon back in the ground, which is really ridiculous already. And so they have to move it. They'd have to move it south or west and south, and then it goes through all of our neighborhoods and through towns. And we're concerned that there's not been any thought put into the danger of those pipelines. That pipeline network would be have to be protected. Local authorities would have to be ready for an accident. We'd have to protect it forever, basically, because what this does is it perpetuates the fossil fuel industry. It gives them a way to keep burning fossil fuels because we've given them a free sewer system to use. So this is an ongoing fight. You've heard probably about the yellow dots in the upper Midwest are all ethanol facilities. So that's now happening. These companies are driving ahead with pipelines, and they don't quite go this direction in their plans anymore, but they're trying to pull all the carbon dioxide out of the ethanol plants and send it up to North Dakota to dump in this gray area up here. The other big plans are Exxon is trying to put it all offshore down here in the Gulf of Mexico. So stuff is moving, and now there's billions of dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill that the Biden administration is touting as part of their climate plan that is ready to put pipes in the ground and ready to start this across the country. But here's some hope. So in the meantime, there are folks trying to hold the carbon kingpins accountable. The great state of New Jersey just filed a suit last October that is one of now 24 or so suits across the country. Connecticut, Massachusetts, Delaware, big states in the East, lots of cities, Baltimore, Hoboken, Charleston, South Carolina, a whole bunch of different places are suing on the grounds that the oil companies knew better, and they sold us a product that was effectively a dangerous and defective product. So they're being sued under consumer safety law and consumer deception. Here, I have these on our website, but if you read these lawsuits, it reads like a crime story. It shows that climate change is not just a disaster, but it's a crime story. And we have all the evidence. We have a lot of evidence. We have thousands of pages of their documents showing how much they knew and what they did about making the rest of us avoid that knowledge or escape it. Another investigation that gives me hope is in the House of Representatives over the last couple of years. Of course, now we don't have the majority anymore, but they uncovered thousands of pages of industry documents. They're now taken down by the Republicans, but we have them all on Climate Investigation Center. And in these documents, even the oil executives writing their emails say, well, downplay how much we're actually going to do. Let's talk about carbon capture, but don't make too many promises about it. So it's really nasty stuff if you read the detail and this fight where they're actively trying to get people to think they care, and they're saying we're all net zero and we're all going to solve this problem. We're all in it together. It's a big dilemma, and yes, we're honest actors, but in their own emails they're still forging ahead for more oil and trying to do what they do best, which is drill oil out of the ground and sell it to us so we can burn it. Here's the cover memo of that document. This is fresh news, December. These documents just came out. So great thing to thumb through and read. And there's tons of stuff on carbon capture and on the policy arena in there. And that's the end of my many, many slides, but try to leave a lot of time for conversation here.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate all of this. It was amazing. And I know a lot of your work already. So that's really something to see you put it all together, though. It's just phenomenal. I was just curious if you are aware of that lawsuit that was just filed against Shell's directors.
Yes. Yeah, that's the first of its kind, and it's still playing out, but it's the same type of scenario where they're now holding the directors accountable, but it's a different tactic. Directors of companies have very specific duties, and oversight is one of them, and that the directors know better too is another big question, because directors are not from the company. They often are, they're often from other companies, and they come in and they sit calmly and oversee the company, and they have to, they have legal responsibilities. So that's an interesting lawsuit. There's also very recently a lawsuit was filed by Puerto Rico under racketeering statute. So it's under federal RICO law, which is what took down the mob. It's about lying and conspiring to lie. and it's a pretty strong case. And of course, Puerto Rico has been hammered by hurricanes and has a pretty strong case of being hurt.
Just a reminder to everybody that you can put your questions into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll be looking for them. And there is one in the Q&A already, and that is, are the recent suits able to affect new CCS EOR CO2 pipeline permitting?
These lawsuits, not directly, but I think there are probably other legal means by which we could, those could happen. The suits specifically talk about advertising. If you read, for example, the Massachusetts suit or Washington, D.C. filed one, even the New Jersey ones, they say your false advertising is a problem. You're pretending people could be misled by these ads and think that when they go to an Exxon station, they're filling up with algae or they're filling up with clean fuel because you're showing us that you're doing something that you're not doing. And the Exxon response would be, well, we're not showing what we're doing now, we're showing what we're trying to do. But in court, that's flimsy. And, so those lawsuits won't directly stop the projects, but the overall, effect is they're going to be held accountable in probably a very long process in court for this deception. And, that may strip away some of the ways that they can take advantage of all of us.
I wanted to just touch on something you said near the end when you were talking about the pipelines, and you were showing Pennsylvania, and
Yeah.
I'm talking about how we have too many holes in the ground here. As it happens, when we learned about Pennsylvania participating in a CO2 transport plan initiative by the Great Plains Institute, we found out that our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has been working on this for nearly 20 years. And not to protect us, of course, but to find how many places they could stash carbon in Pennsylvania. And they not only determined that it was 2.4 billion metric tons, pardon me, 2.4 billion metric tons could be stored in Pennsylvania. And the area that they show for low cost storage is the Marcellus and the Utica. So they're looking to put it in some of those holes.
Yeah. I mean, it's here's how I always, they'll try anything. And especially if they're being paid, if they're getting payments for dumping carbon, which is what they're angling for, they're being to be paid to put away their own trash, essentially. They will try to put it anywhere. But the thing that is remarkable, I didn't include this in a slide, is Lee Raymond, the Exxon CEO for many years, who was part of their denial phase or hard denial phase, said in 2007, he's asked about this at a National Petroleum Council presentation. He headed up a National Petroleum Council report. The National Petroleum Council is a federally authorized body that is supposed to report to the government on the state of play on petroleum. And it was founded decades ago, I think in the 30s or 40s, and it reports periodically. So he says, yeah, carbon capture. He's asked about carbon capture. Carbon capture was a big part of the Bush-Cheney energy plan in 2005. And it was really where the research kicked into. That's where all the fracking research was kicked off as well, right? So Lee Raymond says, yeah, that's going to be hard. And he has the math in his head. And he says, even just capturing the carbon from coal plants would be X tens of thousands of barrels of carbon dioxide a day. And if you total that up, it's more than we handle in all of our pipelines that exist today, including produced water. When they drill for oil, a lot of water comes out of the earth too, and they have to put that back in the earth. So he had a volumetric calculation in his head that showed how enormous it was. And if you think about it, every pound or every ton of coal that you burn, you end up with twice that much carbon dioxide because the carbon atoms attach to oxygen atoms. So it's more stuff. So if you put a 2-mile long coal train into a power plant and burn it, you'd end up with a double the length train going back out full of carbon dioxide or pipeline. It's an enormous amount of material, and you run out of space very quickly. So if you think about the Marcellus, yeah, they could put it down there, but you'd probably have a lot of earthquakes in Western PA. and they have to also pull the brine out to make room, and then you have this salty water at the surface. And we know from Ian Urbina's work in the New York Times and other exposés that is often radioactive. And great, so we're creating a sort of a cascade of problems if we lean on that. And I know, we're all doing the best we can to expose this stuff, but they have a head of steam, and they have the government behind them, and they have, massive industries, subsidies lined up, as some people in the chat I see have itemized the subsidies in IRA, and other bills. So it's great.
Mary has a question in the chat. How much of the deep underground storage is really EOR, and where they hope the CO2 stays in the ground in the old oil wells after rounding out the oil, as you just talked about with gas and oil, and they get big tax credits. So yeah, so
well, the EOR, most of it's EOR is the truth. There's very little to none that is purely just keeping carbon in the ground. And of course, in EOR, some of that comes back up because they're creating oil Perrier, right? And they pump it back out. So EOR is enhanced oil recovery. Sorry, EOR is the Satartia pipeline was piping carbon dioxide from a natural carbon dioxide bubble underground, a dome that had mostly carbon dioxide, some hydrogen sulfide and other stuff. They pipe that up, they compress it, and it's essentially a fracking liquid, but it's not really fracking. They're just sort of repressurizing old sticky oil wells that aren't producing anymore. They can't suck the oil out of the ground, so they blow carbon dioxide in, and it forces the oil out. And it was seen as a positive thing. Well, it's been done by industry for a long time as a tactic for getting out sticky oil, but now they were calling it a climate solution for a long time. Of course, you're going forward to go backwards because you're pulling more oil out of the ground to burn. But now that's sort of, they've modulated that language. They don't try to talk about it that way anymore. But there's 5,000 some miles of pipelines, CO2 pipelines in the country. All of them are for enhanced oil recovery right now. They're pretending that it's going to change, but that's the truth.
And Bill has a question, and it ties into something else I was curious about as well. He asks, are the earlier industrial executives who cast doubt beyond the statute of limitations?
That's a really good question. Statute of limitations is different in different states. Most of the cases are going for, are talking about current activities that these companies, it's an ongoing problem. You are still advertising this stuff. You're still deceiving us. Some of that will just be in the court of public opinion. It's certainly a long time ago, right? And talking about the 80s, it's a long time ago for me, and it's longer ago. It's before most people were born at this point. So you lose attention that way. But on the other hand, I know a lot of young people who, when they learn this story, are incensed to learn that they knew better. They thought that climate change was just discovered. And it was just, we just realized this problem, and oh my God, it's a bad problem. We should deal with it. They don't realize that it's been known since their parents were born, and industry has actively tried to stop us from dealing with it because it would interrupt their business plans. So it's that we'll see how that goes in court. It's a good question. I think I think the story will be told about their actions at the very least. And if you read these lawsuits, they bring up specific people who did specific things in this history.
Well, one of the questions I had related to this was that we have a hydrogen hub proposed for Western Pennsylvania, one for Eastern Pennsylvania as well. And that pertains to Ohio and West Virginia. And I know we have some West Virginians here today, but one of the guys who's really been pushing that out in Pittsburgh area is a guy named Morgan O'Brien, who used to be with People's Gas, but before that he was moving up the ranks at Edison Electric at exactly the time that they were part of the Global Climate Coalition. And so, I wonder if there's any way to tie this back to him personally, and try to at least show the connections that these are the same players, like you've been saying, that are pushing all of this stuff now, but he's got quite a megaphone to do it.
Yeah, well, there's a whole body of research on beyond the oil companies. If you look up the term utilities knew, some colleagues of mine did research on all that the utilities knew about this issue and tried to block. They were instrumental in the Global Climate Coalition, for example, the very beginning of the hardcore denial episode, it really ramped up once Clinton was elected in 92. That's when they saw the threat, because of course they had a stay of execution with Reagan and Bush for 12 years. There's not going to be any real environmental laws passed. And so they, if you think about it, the evolution of the issue, there's a big National Academy of Sciences report in the late 70s. It starts to be a big thing, but we're also dealing with acid rain and then Superfund and the ozone hole. There's a lot of big things going on. You've got in northern New Jersey, you got the midnight dumpers bringing toxic waste into the Poconos and dribbling it all over everywhere. You've got a lot of other local and national and international environmental issues that took front seat, but climate change was there and nothing was going to happen during the Reagan years. And then Clinton gets elected with Gore. And then they start really ramping up the anti-environmental campaigns and trying to attack any policies. They killed a Gore initiative called the BTU tax, which was basically a carbon tax that said, based on the carbon in the fuel, we should tax it and put the money to good. And it would have changed the world if it, and it was a minor tax in retrospect, like pennies on the gallon. And the Koch brothers, the Koch Industries goons and the American Petroleum Institute goons killed this thing in months. Like it didn't take much time at all, because they just had Newt Gingrich, they had other operatives in the Congress, and they just killed it. But that was a real fork in the road, because then we have no climate policy for a few years. Then the International Framework on Climate Change, which was born in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, is by force of George Bush saying we don't want any mandatory initiatives at all agreed at this meeting in Rio. He said, I'll come there, but I'm not going to agree to anything. I think some of that is in that Frontline documentary. He says, you think the greenhouse effect, what about the White House effect? And he's pumping up that he's an environmentalist to try to beat Clinton and Gore, but then he loses the election. When by 1992, the treaty is implemented, or it's not a treaty, it's a convention. By 95, the voluntary measures are doing nothing. Emissions are going nowhere. And that's when they start the path to the Kyoto Protocol you all have heard about in 1997. So that was saying we need something mandatory. We need rules. We need promises. We need compliance mechanisms. So get to 1997, Clinton and Gore have been reelected, obviously, and they have a head of steam. And they agree to the Kyoto Protocol. It's a very weakened agreement. Most environmentalists thought, well, we got half a loaf, but we got some. And then they come back, and of course, the Congress and the industry guys hammer them even harder in 98 and 99. And then Gore loses or doesn't lose to Bush. And then we have Bush Cheney. And then we erase another 8 years effectively of policy. So that's how we've lost these decades of a chance to do something different. And it's a cascade of very deliberate actions by corporate actors. So, when I talk to my kids about this and they say, well, how did you screw this up? Like, how come you guys didn't deal with this? And I say, well, people wanted to. There were scientists saying it was sounding the alarm. There were people thinking about solutions. Even Exxon scientists were looking at solar panels. The Exxon scientists in the lab in New Jersey, if you read the Inside Climate News series that was published in 2015, it's called The Road Not Taken, because they found out that the Exxon scientists built a Tesla effectively. They bought an old Bonneville, old truck or car, and they bought a motor company, and they bought a battery company, and they built their own electric vehicle that they drove around the campus. They took it to GM and Ford, who said, nah, we're going to keep burning. We're going to keep selling the engines. But they were thinking ahead. These Exxon scientists, they were the smartest people in the country out at MIT and elsewhere. And they were thinking, we're going to be an energy company, not an oil company. We're going to sell solar. They bought a solar company, and then they ditched it. So we had, those are the things that I think they really need to be held accountable on. Is we've had chances, we've had the knowledge, and we've had a chance to turn the Titanic a little bit, but they kept us heading for the iceberg. It's not, sorry, I just heard that on NPR, the Titanic is coming back to theater. So that was stuck in my head. But we had a bunch of shots at doing better, and we have been held back by deliberate actions. That's the bottom line. Somebody asked about Frontline doing a follow-up. I don't know about that. There are a couple more films coming out, but I think, yeah, I try to encourage them to do more on CCS in the second and third episodes of that series, which are not as tight as the first one. The first one is the best of the three. There is a bit about gas and fracking and the power of the gas industry in the second 2 hours of that 3-hour series. But it could have been stronger on CCS, and it definitely needs to be done.
You were talking about utilities new. I just wanted to toss in for those folks in the western part of the state and in Ohio and West Virginia that one of the other companies that was involved in all of that at the time was Duquesne Electric. So for those of you who know that company well, that's one of the ones. I don't know, have any companies actually reformed?
There are good utilities and bad utilities. I mean, some are greener than others, but generally, they have most of them remain with such monopolistic control of the way we consume power, and they put all the costs on us. I mean, I remember when I lived in Philadelphia, there was a little secret charge on like page 6 of your electric bill that was like Limerick, overcharges, and it was like 0.01 cents per kilowatt hour. They were still charging us for the wasted money building the Limerick nuclear power plant. So they get away with it. There are recent exposés showing that they take our money that we pay in utility bills and they use it for lobbying against clean power all over the country. A whole bunch of if you look at this website, Energy and Policy, there's the utilities new link, but they've revealed a lot of scandal where the utilities, and we all depend on them, right? It's the most direct thing. Like, we got to have the lights on, and so we generally think that the utilities are doing something as in the public interest, and it used to be that utilities were seen as a public good, but now it's not that way. They're money makers like everyone else, and so are the gas utilities. You've heard a lot about the gas stoves problem recently, and the gas utilities are separate from the electric utilities, but interconnected in some political ways. But they just sell us gas and they sell businesses gas, and that's a one-way street for them. They don't have an alternative business. It's like coal. And in the utilities case, you had this cabal between the mining companies, the coal mining companies who were mining in the coal belt, West Virginia to Illinois, and also in Wyoming, but they needed a customer, and the customer was the utilities, and they needed to get it from one way to the other, and it's the railroads. And the railroads were, most of the stuff on rail cars was coal, like more than half it sometimes was coal. So they were making buckets of money moving it. So I called it the coal industrial complex. Like, you had the mining companies, the rail companies, and the utilities all in this game together. And why would they want it to change? They're making a lot of money selling us power in a way that, with these old power plants that are already paid for, and they don't have to do anything to them until the Clean Air Act comes along. But it's it's tough, like any environmental problem you've ever dealt with. Once something is happening, once an entity is making money on something, they don't want it to change, and they feel like they have a right to do whatever they're doing. See DDT, right? Once they're selling DDT and they're making money on it, why would we change that? And that's a fundamental selfishness and greed problem, and it's a human condition. But that's the dilemma with all these things. I'm putting my stuff for free in the river, get my junk in the river for free. Why would I want to stop? Why would I want to pay to deal with my waste when I'm getting away with this for free? And it's that's the ultimate tragedy of the commons, or the thing that you all fight on a day-to-day basis, is we have that force among us that many people don't think about the common good.
Well, that takes us to the government and some of the comments that ask about IRA, for instance, and all that money that's in 45Q and all of it. And William asks about the lawsuits. Is there any possibility of lawsuits against government agencies who approve of fossil fuel projects? FERC, PHMSA come up among them. But one of the problems too with CO2 pipelines is that they're not being regulated at the federal level. So this next generation, the regulatory scheme isn't quite that clear yet.
Yeah, that is a major outcome of, since you've probably talked to Dan Ziegart, the Federal Pipeline Safety Administration last spring issued a report saying, we looked at this, they looked at the Satartia accident. They issued the largest fine ever they'd ever done on any pipeline accident. And they said in their report, we need all new regulations for these pipelines. The existing regulations for pipelines are not adequate. These pipelines are different. The material in them is different. It's dangerous in a different way. And they're now supposedly pushing for pipelines to CO2 pipelines to be regulated. Meanwhile, the IRA and this money is hitting the ground, and many people think that the companies want to get the pipelines done before these new regulations, and they'd be grandfathered in because the new regulations are likely to be more strict. And frighteningly, in the pipeline safety report, they said avoid low-lying areas with these pipelines. So, okay, you guys know where pipelines are in your area. They're not on the hills. They're not away from people. They're in the lowest lying areas. They're along rail beds. They're along highways. They're in the easiest place to lay a pipeline is in a flat, low-lying area. So there's a little contradiction there. If the pipeline safety guys are saying we don't want these things in valleys or in low-lying areas where the carbon dioxide, if it leaks, would collect and would drown people. And meanwhile, the Biden administration and the energy secretary and others are saying, go, 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 carbon capture is our plan, and throwing billions of dollars at it. So it's there's a collision at some point on those two things. And I think the larger questions about whether we can sue the government on this, there's a number of lawsuits, there's a number of attempts at holding the government accountable. It's seen as a less likely target because they can just sort of cover themselves by showing a sort of a continuum of effort, where they were saying and doing some of the right things on climate change anyway. I think the Department of Energy is complicit in all of this because they've done a lot of the research has been funded through DOE. I looked on the DOE website at one point for anything about risk assessment around carbon dioxide pipelines. Not one document I could find except for I don't know if the West Virginians on the call remember the Mountaineer project. It was a power plant, a coal-fired power plant in West Virginia where American Electric Power, the utility in the Midwest, set up a carbon capture experiment paid for by taxpayer dollars in part. And they were building just a small network of pipelines on part of the power plant, just a little waste stream. They were trying to capture some of the carbon dioxide and put it back in the coal bed that's right under the power plant, essentially. And in doing so, they had a risk assessment done, and these were 8-inch pipelines. These are baby pipelines compared to what we would need to move all the industrial carbon. And they said people should stay back, a quarter mile or something from these pipelines. It's the only risk assessment I've ever found that the government has done, and it's hidden, and it's not. I think it is a massive blind spot. The pipeline problem, how we move it. Like you could imagine, ideally, having a carbon capture thing, a magical vacuum cleaner situated straight above one of these saline aquifers, and you've got a big cork to put on the top, and safely, maybe we can put the carbon away. But that's hard to imagine that happening on a scale that would matter to the climate. The best solution is, of course, not burning fossil fuels in the first place and getting away from them. But we're in this dilemma where there's a big head of steam on how to fix this with carbon capture. I see it. There's a ton of other great questions here. If anybody wants to get in touch with me directly, the easiest is info@climateinvestigations.org. That's the general box where I definitely will see it, because there's not a ton of mail on there. And and thanks for the invitation today, though. This has been great, and I'll do it anytime.
I really appreciate it. And if you have time for just one more question, and we didn't touch on the investor community. And so if you have any final words to say about what we could be doing to try to get investors to stop putting their money into this.
Well, I think it's pointing out the liability. I think investors are ultimately part of the problem and have turned a blind eye to a lot of these failings, or they've been deceived themselves, right? They've bought it because they read the company literature and they think this is how it's going to go, and I want to invest in or they see the ad on TV with Exxon and the algae or Exxon and the carbon capture, and they think, well, that's a progressive company. They're doing positive stuff. Look at this ad. So I think there is a potential backlash there. The coolest thing that's happened is the backlash by the Exxon shareholders, which has been growing. And there's another film, by the way, that's soon to be on YouTube called Black Gold, all about Exxon. It was on Paramount Plus last year. And it's a really entertaining film. I happen to be in it too, but it's beyond me. It's also entertaining. And it's got a lot of information about this and a lot of information about Sister Pat Daly from Northern New Jersey, who just passed away in December, who was fighting Exxon for many years. And just trying to get them to pay attention to this issue was a mountain to climb. And Lee Raymond, there's footage of Lee Raymond shutting her off at a presentation where she's just saying, you got to deal with this, Exxon. This is a big deal. And this is, it's an existential threat. It's a moral, ethical failing of these companies to deal with this. And they're leaving all the rest of us at risk, and they know better.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you're seeing all of the props being given to you in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
This was fantastic. I really appreciate it. There was a question about how quick can we get this video, so I think people want to start sharing it immediately.
Great.
So thank you so much. I don't know if I'll see you in an hour, but maybe. So
yeah. All right. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.